But what you start with in the book is really interesting to me. You put this question on a philosophical pedestal, on a structural level, in which you talk about liberty and equality. So to say, these seem like very intertwined terminologies, that liberty would lead to equality, and equality is embedded within the liberal order, within the order where choice is maximized. That is, so to speak, the politics of the terminology and how these can be perceived. And you begin with it by putting these debates between liberty and equality to the forefront, and locating all of the structural issues that Indian Muslims faced later on after the partition as a result of this choice that was made at the very beginning of what India is supposed to be. First and foremost, sir, I would like to understand this difference that you've articulated. What does that mean? And how does that change the potential future of any polity or any society and any community in the way that it was going to organize itself as a policy making state?
Well, essentially, the position is that I use this the dichotomy between liberty and equality to basically trace or identify a major issue which had been, I mean, discussed earlier, in the 1930s and so on, when there was the prospect of India achieving independence. And the question was whether the future India would be a unitary state, would it be a federal state, and there would be, and of course there was the question of how the minorities would be treated. And to that extent, there were dialogues, certainly in the 30s, between Jinnah and the Nehrus, for example, which led ultimately to the Nehru report. And the point was that Jinnah was conscious. I mean, Jinnah was a congressman at that stage. He was quite a novel product because he wasn't from the UP heartland. He was a Bombay barrister, and he was very westernized in his thinking. But the point is that despite the westernization, which he shared with, in that sense, also with Pandit Nehru and so on, he was conscious of communalism and and he had this fear and a sense that, look, that his community should be in some respects protected, that there has to be some degree whereby there would be some leverage, there would be some degree whether the majority cannot, as it were, trespass upon certain rights. Now the thing is that in a sense this position, I mean, was to some extent entrenched in colonial secularism, because you had the system of elections. For example, you had separate electorates and things like that, which of course the Congress regarded as part of the divide and rule policy, and this thing. But the point is that whatever that may be, the issue is that the minorities had some level of protection in terms of their representation, because ultimately in a democracy the question of representation is key. And if people vote, and this is where the issue of liberty and equality comes in, because if people have the liberty to vote according to, say, for example, their caste or their community, which unfortunately we're seeing in today's elections. I mean, for example, the present chief minister of UP, Yogi Adityanath, talked about, an election between 80 and 20. Now, 80-20 means what? It means the majority versus the minority. And therefore, the position is that if people decide to vote according to their religion, then and they have the liberty to do so because there are no restraints on them. There are no separate electorates. There's no proportional representation. There's no form of any guardrails, basically, which would essentially prevent a majority from this thing because it's ultimately, and I quote a passage by, I think, Jonathan Lord Sumption, who was the head of the Supreme Court in or a judge in the Supreme Court in the UK Supreme Court, or the English Supreme Court rather, where he talks about this business of majority being really it's a thing of numbers. It doesn't give legitimacy, and that is the key to any democratic. You can't have a winner takes all solution because that's basically what liberty has boiled down to. And I think at that time there were academics and there were people who were apart from politicians. I mean, people like, for example, Ivor Jennings, who was a great constitutional lawyer, was saying that look, you can't. It may be difficult in a country which has very is a very multi-religious country in a sense where caste also plays a role, where there's a great deal of difference. It's a subcontinent. That in that kind of context, things like separate electorates and things like that are not uncommon. In fact, they're very necessary. Um, and the point was that therefore the question of equality is really the position that liberty has to be restrained. Liberty has to be restrained when it comes to the matter of representation, because ultimately, when we talk about politics to acquire any legitimacy has to be a discourse between different people. It has to be the art of the possible. And if you actually have a situation, as you have unfortunately today, where one party, one community have a say over everything, you are now reaching a position where, and of course, I deal in part in also the matter of delimitation, because the issue of delimitation, we have also a problem where people would address delimitation in terms of saying, well, you don't want the majority, that majority rule, one man, one vote. That's the that is the signature. That is the most important thing about a democracy. And of course, the problem is that democracy is much wider than a notion of one man, one vote. And certainly, for example, in India, I mean, we had a situation where Mrs. Gandhi, for good reasons, I think, passed the 42nd Amendment, where you had a freezing of the census from 1971 levels. And the reason that was done was obviously to ensure that you should not reward states which cannot control their populations. And if they cannot control their populations, that issue goes much deeper than merely the question of population control. It leads to things like, for example, education of women and general enhancement of the matters of social indicators, which would basically mean that people who that government is prodded or is directed to consider factors like, for example, literacy, and particularly female literacy, and their involvement in job. So basically, the point is that it's not simply a question. Now, of course, delimitation raises its own problems. It's distinct from what the issues we faced in the 1940s. But the issues we faced in the 1940s was also something of great concern, because it really went to the heart of whether we were to maintain what I call the glittering prize of a united India. And I think that was a very important thing, and I think that it was something which, frankly, Congress, you know, singularly failed to do. And I mean that, and I think the point is that partition was really, in a sense, I think, certainly for the Muslims, I think it was the worst possible solution. I mean, my Pakistani friends would probably may disagree,
Mm,
but a lot of them actually do agree because the way Pakistan has developed, as a kind of garrison state, it's been most.
mm,
But the point about it was that there was a need for some kind of safeguards,
mm,
and of course, some of those things were debated in the Constituent Assembly, proportional representation and things like that, which has been discussed. But I think critically, the important thing was actually a greater federal structure, because I think the way which I see, and I think that in a sense probably Jinnah also saw, was that the answer to the kind of Hindu communal uh, threat was really a greater emphasis on regional identities. And if you look at, for example, the two states which were neutered in the partition, neutered in the political sense because they were divided and they were rendered almost toothless, in terms of being able to really, in a political sense, were of course Punjab and Bengal,
Bengal,
which broadly speaking were states
Muslim
which
dominated.
were not very communal or or very casteist.
Mm,
And the point was, and they of course were slightly, they had a slight Muslim majority.
mm,
That was it. But the point about those states were that had we had that thing,
mm,
we could have had, for one thing, I think a greater sort of federal structure,
mm,
a federal a sense of and a sense where a lot of this poison of which has emanated from the cow belt, would
mm.
essentially have been to some extent diluted.
Mm.